Here we are at chapter 35. In the tower cell, Alice was feeling decidedly uneasy. Once Buttle had recognized her, there had been a little purpose in trying to continue the pretense that she was a dizzy-headed noblewoman on the way to her wedding. But surprisingly, Kieran had made no attempt to extract any further information from her. He had simply frowned, called his guard, and had her escorted to this prison. Max, armed only with a belt dagger that was more decorative than functional, had been prepared to defend her, but she stopped him. She didn't want to be responsible for his death. He and the two maids were escorted away to be imprisoned. She had no doubt that her men at arms, quartered in the castle's barracks, would join them before long. It was Karen's apparent lack of action or interest that had her worried most of all. Obviously, he was the centre of the strange happenings that had been going on at Castle Mackendale. To what purpose? The most logical one was the intention that he had ascribed to Ormond and Will, that he was planning to hand over the castle to Scotty invaders. After all, having usurped the rights of both Siren and Ormond, he could hardly expect to gain King Duncan's endorsement as Lord of Mackendale. His only alternative would be to look outside the kingdom for a reward. Whatever he had planned, he was up to no good. It seemed strange that he hadn't tried to question her to find out what she and Bill had been planning and how much they knew. Frankly, she would have expected to be questioned most rigorously, even tortured. She turned, startled, as the single door to the room opened to admit Kieran. He looked around the room, taking in the scant furnishing, a table and two chairs, and a wooden bed with a thin straw mattress and two threadable blankets. There was a fireplace where a small fire was burning, and a single oil lamp with a polished metal reflector provided light in the room. The window, barred with vertical iron stakes, could be covered by a heavy curtain to prevent the worst of the wind entering. At the moment, the curtain was drawn back. "Nice and comfy," he said cheerfully. "Things could be worse," Alice said. He nodded heartily. "Oh, yes, indeed they could, and I think you should bear that in mind." "I assume my people are safe?" she asked. Kieran shrugged. "They're all tucked up in the cellar. Not too comfortable, but it has a good, strong door. One of your men at arms tried to argue. He was slightly injured, but he'll recover. I hope you don't expect me to thank you for that," she said. Again he shrugged, dismissing the matter of her bodyguard. He gestured towards the table and chairs. "Let's sit down. I think it's time we had a little chat." So it's starting, she thought, considering him warily, but there was no point in resisting, and she moved to the table, pulled one of the chairs out and sat straight back. Karen dropped into the chair opposite her and lolled back, one leg crossed over the other. He grinned easily at her. "Relax," he said. "I just wanted to ask you a few questions." He reached into a pocket and produced a strange blue gemstone about the size of a quail egg. He began to roll it back and forth in his hands. A worry stone, Alice thought. She had heard some people use such objects to calm their nerves. Perhaps, she thought, Sir Karen wasn't quite as relaxed as he seemed. "It's not the questions that bother me," she said. "It's what will happen when you don't get any answers." The grin faded, and he frowned at her, actually looking a little hurt. "You surely don't think I'd torture you," he said. Not a monster, you know. I am a knight, after all." "You seem to have forgotten some of your duties as a knight," she countered. He hesitated before answering. "Well, perhaps it looks that way, but it's easy to take that point of view when you don't know the full picture. For years I kept this castle strong and well defended. All I asked from Siren was a little consideration, a little gratitude for my efforts. But no, he channeled everything to his son. There was nothing for me, not even a guarantee that I'd even be employed once Ormond took over. I spent the greater part of my life, adult life, safeguarding the kingdom's border, and I've received no more than a freelancer's pay for it. I deserve better than that." "Perhaps you did, but you had no right to look for your rewards from the Scotty," she ventured, wanting to see his reaction. It wasn't long in coming. He looked at her keenly. "So you figured that out, did you? I wonder how much else you know." His gaze dropped away from hers, and he looked down at the blue gem. Her eyes followed his and studied it. It was perfectly round, she saw, and it seemed to grow deeper as you looked into it. She had the fascinating impression that, if she looked hard enough, she could see beneath the surface of the stone, and into the depths beneath. She leaned forward a little. It was odd that such a small stone could appear to be so deep, so very deep. Karen noticed her interest. "It's very beautiful, isn't it?" he said. His voice was quiet and soothing, so relaxing. "I often wonder how there can be so many layers in such a small object. Look at it. Look as it turns." He slowly revolved the stone, and she saw that he was right. The blue seemed to drop away and away from the light. It even in ever-deepening layers. It seemed impossible that they could all be in such a tiny gem, and so beautiful, so blue. She loved blue, she realized. She had never before realized that blue was her favorite color. "You never told me your real name," he said gently. "It's Alice. Alice Mainwaring." There seemed to be no harm in telling him that. After all, he knew Lady Gwendolen wasn't her real name, was a false identity. Strange, she thought, how that little blue stone seemed to be growing bigger with every second. "You don't really have a fiancé, do you?" he said, and she could hear the genuine amusement in his voice. She laughed in reply. "No, I'm afraid not," she admitted. I'm doomed to be an old maid." It was a shame that they were enemies, she thought. He was actually quite a nice person. She meant to look up and tell him so. "Keep looking at the blue," his voice was very gentle, and she nodded agreement. "Of course." He was silent for a while, letting the study those shifting blue tones. It was very relaxing, she thought. "What about your friend Will?" he said softly. "No romantic there?" She smiled quietly at the question, then answered for a few seconds. "We have known each other forever," she said. "We were very close before we began his training." "As a juggler, you mean?" she said. She was on the brink of shaking her head when some instinct stopped her. "Will's she began, but the same instinct stopped her saying any more. She blinked, realizing that she had been on the point of saying Will's a ranger. She lurched back in her chair, as if reaching back from the edge of a cliff. In a way, she was. She tore her eyes away from the blue stone on the table, amazed at how much effort it took to do so. "What are you doing?" she demanded, horrified that she had been about to betray Will. She racked her brain now, trying to think what she had told him, how much she had revealed to him. Her name, she thought, but that didn't matter too much, so long as he hadn't told him Will was a... She stopped herself. Best not ever to think of it, she thought. That damn blue stone obviously had some very strange properties. Karen was smiling at her. It was a surprisingly friendly smile, considering. "You're a strong one," he told her admiringly. "Once a person gets in that deep, it's very unusual for them to come back. Well done. What is that thing?" She pointed at the stone, loathing it. He picked it up from the table, tossed it in the air and caught it, and then placed it back in his inner pocket. "Oh, just a little bauble I assume my friend's with," he said, rising and turning towards the door. He paused with the door open, then his smile faded. "We'll do this again," he said, "and the next time it will be a lot easier. It always is after you've given in once. After that, it gets easier and easier every time. I'll see you in an hour or so." The door closed behind him. Alice heard the key turn in the lock and dropped her hands onto her forearms on the table. She felt totally exhausted. 20 meters from the castle wall, Will stopped and dropped prone to the ground. He had chosen a spot that was free of snow, but the grass was saturated, and within a few minutes the freezing damp had soaked through his clothes. The temptation to move, to shift position, or so as to get away from that numbing dampness was enormous. But Will had trained for years in a hard school, and he lay unmoving except for his eyes. The cloak would conceal him from watchers on the walls, he knew, and the deep cowl would mask the pale blur of his face, which would otherwise show like a beacon. Before he went any further, he wanted to study the positions of the sentries on the castle ramparts. From his low position, the walls were outlined against the sky. Dark as the sky was, the walls themselves were even darker, and he could make out the shapes of the sentries as they patrolled. There were 2 men posted to each wall. They marched a constant beat, meeting in the middle, then turning away and marching on to either end, where they turned and marched back again. At each end of the wall was a tower, and a further sentry could be made out at the top of each. Those men didn't march, but leaned against the wall, staring outwards into the night. On a freezing cold night like tonight, he knew they would have a brazier of glowing coals close by to warm them. Xander had told him and he could make out the dim orange glow of the blazes reflected on the sentry's armor. was all to be good, he thought, as the men turned repeatedly to warm their freezing hands by the braziers. They would destroy their night vision. They would still be able to see movement of larger bodies of men, which was their main purpose as sentries, but one lone figure, skilled in the art of unseen movement, would be virtually invisible to them. Set in the middle of the courtyard and rearing high above the walls and the other towers was the keep itself. The faint yellow glow still showed at the very top window. Will's first inclination was to scale the wall at the midpoint, waiting until both sentries had their backs turned, but he discarded the idea as he observed their behavior. There had been no watch for over 2.5 hours now. Xander had told him that the sentries were changed every 3 hours. As a result, the fine edges of alertness with which they had begun their watch had dulled. Nothing had happened for nearly 3 hours, and it was only human of them to think that nothing would happen now. They were tired and bored and beginning to think about the hot dinner and warm drinks. They were only half an hour away. As they met in the middle, they had begun to stop, relax, and chat for a few minutes. The pauses grew longer each time. That would be Will's best chance to go over the wall. While they were stopped and talking, their attention would be diverted, and any small noise he might make would be masked by their own voices. He glanced up at the tower again. On the left-hand battlements, the sentry had began to stand back a little from the wall, obviously wanting to be closer to the warmth of the brazier. That meant that in a few more meters Will would be hidden from his sight. The sentry on the right-hand tower continued to gaze stolidly out into the night, but Will could make out the hunched set of his shoulders. He could imagine the men huddled into his cloak, miserable and cold, his feet hurting, his mind numb and lulled into a state of reduced awareness. There was little danger that the men would look to his right. His gaze was fixed straight ahead. He would climb up the wall by the left tower, he thought. He waited for the wall sentries to conclude one more circuit, counting the seconds it took for the two to walk from one end of their beats back to the center. Once he had scaled the wall, that would be the time he would have to go over the edge and find somewhere to conceal himself. He tensed, ready to move. Slowly he came to his knees. There were scattered clouds scudding across the sky, causing their dim shadows over the ground as they passed. He measured their movement, preparing to match their rhythm. Then, once he was ready, he glided smoothly towards the castle, angling to the left-hand corner, blending into the night as he went. Alright, I'd like to thank you very much for listening to read up to chapter 35. If you'd like to listen to me read chapter 36, then please stay posted and hope I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.